This is the Freedom Pact podcast, the show that brings you ideas that change lives. I am one of your hosts, Lewis, and throughout 2024, we've had some incredible guests on the show that have brought us some even more incredible ideas. We've had guests from Robert Sapolsky to Iain McGilchrist and so many more I could list off. And today in this video, I'm going to be playing you some of the best moments, the best lessons that we learned this year thanks to our guests. I'm looking forward to next year. If there are any guests that you would like to see us bring on the show in 2025, just leave a comment below, let us know, and we will try our best to bring them on the show. Thank you so much if you watched any of our videos in 2024 or supported us in any way, like subscribing to the channel. It means so much to us, and we look forward to bringing you some absolutely incredible content that we've got planned in 2025. But for now, please enjoy this video of the 7 best lessons of 2024.
Everybody thinks they know about dopamine, which it's the neurotransmitter of pleasure. It's the neurotransmitter of reward. Cocaine releases dopamine. All sorts of euphoriants do that. But it turns out dopamine is actually much more interesting than that. It's not so much about reward and pleasure. It's about the anticipation of it. And even more so, it's about the work you were willing to do in order to get that reward, motivated behavior, goal-directed behavior, and such. It comes with all sorts of interesting facets to it. For one thing, what that begins to tell you is if dopamine is mostly about the period before you get the reward, when you're sitting there in the, this is going to be great, this is going to be fantastic, I'm just salivating there with that, it's telling you the happiness is mostly during the pursuit. Where that becomes particularly interesting is how likely you are to get that reward, how certain it is. If you do the work and you're a rat and you've pressed the lever 10 times, or if you're a student and you've studied hard for the exam, or any version of that, how likely are you to get the reward? And it turns out, very logical answer, which is if there's no chance you're going to get the reward, all you do is become helpless and dopamine's got nothing to do with it. If you're absolutely guaranteed to get the reward, you habituate to it pretty quickly. But if it's not quite clear, if you're sort of teetering on this fulcrum of maybe yes, maybe no, I'm feeling lucky today, but I'm such a screw up, and back and forth, teetering there at some psychological equivalent of a 50% chance, maximize the uncertainty. And that's when you pour out dopamine like crazy. So getting maybe calibrated to exactly right, that's where we really work like mad at trying to get what we're anticipated. And that's where the anticipation of it is just so pleasurable.
Dopamine's become one of those words that you hear a lot in the self-help space. You hear things about cheap dopamine and earned dopamine. Are these terms that are quite easy to define, or are those words that, you know, they're not very black and white?
Oh, I suspect they mean all sorts of wildly unscientific things as used, often related to opening up your wallet and sending money to someone or other. No, you know, it used to be like, oh my God, neurotransmitters. What could be more boring and obscure than saying the names of neurotransmitters? And now dopamine is all over the place. Yeah, it's interesting. It's subtle. We do things with it as humans that no other species can do out there, which helps explain some magnificent things we do. It also helps explain probably about 90% of human misery, sort of unique features of dopamine in humans. Different subtypes, nah, not really the science version of it. To add one more ripple of sort of subtlety, not only is dopamine about goal-directed motivation to get something you're anticipating like crazy, it's also about salience signals. This one's important. Pay attention to this. And of course, that intertwines very easily with, I really, really, really want to get this reward. So pay attention to whatever I think is the route by which that's going to happen. But yeah, it suffers from the dread problem of scientific jargon of, oh my God, it's become popular with the public.
Certainly. And another way, another word that's become popular in the same vein then is this idea of a detox, a dopamine detox. Is this something that we should pay no mind to when we see these, self-help books and podcasts talking about dopamine detoxing?
Well, I think as long as you don't view it as anything other than metaphor and not a particularly poetic metaphor, nonetheless is tapping into something very valid. You take, I don't know, some close relative species, you take a monkey, and what counts as pleasurable in the life of a monkey? Sex and desirable food, and maybe when it's hot, getting a spot in the shade and somebody grooming you, and that's about it. And you get to us, and the range of things that could be pleasurable range from, like, you've just spent 80 years carving a magnificent statue, to the flowers smell good, to an orgasm, to like a good haiku, or like an incredible range, including convincing yourself that because of ritualistic stuff you're doing, you're going to reach paradise after you're dead. Like all sorts of stuff that we humans, we have a wider range of pleasures and a wider range of things to anticipate by orders of magnitude than any other species out there. And the trouble is, you got the same dopamine dial for all of those that go to from 0 to 10. In us humans, it has to habituate really quickly. You need to be able to get a signal to the dopamine system that, okay, we're not doing multiple orgasms right now. Instead, we're going to do rhyming couplets in Victorian poetry. Rescale what 0 means and what 10 means and everything in between. What that means is the system has to habituate really fast, because it's got to be ready to scale up or down to whatever the next pleasure is you're anticipating. And what does that mean? Whatever was like this wonderful surprise yesterday is what you feel entitled to today, and isn't going to be enough tomorrow, because it habituates. And that's like this whole feature of us, that the more we eat, the hungrier we get.
Fantastic. And we've mentioned there a few things that people should look out for when they're listening to this subject, the cheap dopamine, the detoxes. But we've talked about things that we don't want people to pay attention to. But what is one thing that you wish more people understood about dopamine?
That we should be very on guard to the habituation. It is very, very easy. It is a necessity for how our brains are wired, that whatever flattens you with pleasure today really is not going to be enough tomorrow, and always be on guard with that. I mean, we all have versions of that. Oh my God, if only I could go back and have my first kiss again, the first time whatever. That's just a sort of representation of that. Be very on guard to the fact that we get hungry again way too easy. And maybe a way to constantly be on guard against that is to do some version of this detoxing metaphor, which is reflect on the pleasures, the artificial ones, the engineered magnitude more what the brain ever normally generates on its own. Be very aware of them, because you habituate to them quickly, and because they so overpower your dopamine system. Like, we did not evolve for dealing with cocaine, for example. Be aware that what that does is it makes everything else seem monochromatic afterward.
As you described, you said that, many people, when they do finally realize that the end is nigh and that they are coming towards the end of their lives, that this does, as you said, in many cases, does seem to, people do, in some cases, they can't even enjoy life more. And I was just wondering if you perhaps had any ideas for the people listening that, perhaps they're not close to the end, but they would like the urgency or the meaning that having that mentality could come with. Are there perhaps any ways or that we could do that, or is it simply the case that we can't trick our mind in that way?
No, we can. And in the past, this was normal. So, for example, it would be normal for a scholar like me sitting at a desk to have, certainly in the 16th, 17th century, to have a skull on my desk. Nothing morbid about it, but it reminds me that I'm not here forever. And another way of remembering death is through religion and its rituals, which do remind one that one is mortal. So I'm not saying that in order to do anything, I'm not here to promote any particular religion, although I think that it's pretty wise to entertain the idea that they may have important elements in them. My goodness. Yes, I think there are things like that, but I think also being aware of what it is we're missing is quite a good practice to sort of think, what is going out of my life, and why am I losing it? Why is life becoming more colorless? Why do things seem more dull, more boring, whatever? And one reason is because we're substituting representations all the time for the actual business of experience. So being there, to coin a phrase, it is rather important. And one way you can do that is through practicing mindfulness and bringing a mindful attitude more and more into your daily life. And what mindfulness is really a way of stilling the ever chatting, ever talkative, ever judgmental left hemisphere, saying, "Oh, it's one of those, and yes, and isn't that bad? And I don't want this. And I don't." Hang on, just let's stop all that chatter, which is called in Eastern mysticism is called monkey mind. Stop that monkey mind, and instead allow oneself to be in the full presence of whatever is there, to appreciate it for what it is, and to find the good in it rather than only see the thing that annoys you, irritates you, or wants you to rebuff it and move away from it. But behind all this is simply an awareness. I'm always asked, I would say, I was going to say I'm often asked, but I'm always asked actually, so what do we do? And there is a list of things that I can suggest, like practicing mindfulness, for example. But I think, and of course, in terms of sorting or trying our best to address, never mind reverse, the damage we are doing to nature and to ancient cultures that have peaceably lived with nature for millennia. Those things need to be done. But very important is that if we don't actually change the way we think, we can't actually move out of this prison of our ego, this tyranny of being ourselves and only ourselves, and feeling that everything revolves around ourselves. If you can let go of that, you've shed a burden and you can enter into a degree of freedom, I think. One of the things I've been thinking about is the paradox, of course. I mean, I write about it in The Master and His Emissary. The paradox that once you've lost the capacity to be intuitively present, once you become a person who is constantly examining your own consciousness, so you're self-conscious all the time, you lose very much. We know that. But the paradox is once you've got that self-consciousness, how do you get rid of it again? you can only do so, it seems, by an effort, a self-conscious effort to be less self-conscious. Now, although that does sound paradoxical, it's not impossible. And it's really what I mean by being aware of what we're doing, to be aware that I'm constantly trying to inspect what's happening as though somehow it's not really me. I'm not there in the flow. I'm something else. But we are what we are. And when you become too self-conscious, and schizophrenia is an illness in which self-awareness and self-consciousness of a not helpful kind becomes intensified, people no longer are able to do spontaneous acts. For example, even standing up or sitting down, they describe as a problem. They have to think through what are the series of steps I have to do. Now, if you take that single image of trying to stand up or sit down, something we do fluently and unconsciously, if you have to think it through, you don't do it well. Now, there are many things that we know are like this. I mean, if you're just doing something so simple as typing, if you don't think about it, you go fine. Once you watch your fingers, you start making lots of errors. And the same's playing a piece of music. If you're in the flow of it and not thinking about where your fingers are going, you can play it really beautifully as a whole. But when you're thinking about your fingers, they get between you, as it were, and the experience. So one way of thinking about our modern world is that we're consciously trying to analyze everything, instead of letting that go and relying more on our intuitions. That's a very important thing, because intuition has lost its status. People are convinced by a band of half-baked psychologists who are going around earning enormous incomes, going to big corporations and telling people not to trust their intuitions. And I mean, not only is this a waste of time and money, but it's actually toxic, because it's through honing one's intuitions that one is capable of making wise decisions. We don't necessarily do better by thinking all the time about things. The unconscious realm is not some murky sort of tank down in the basement. The unconscious realm is where we do most of our living. Only a tiny bit, and it's been estimated at 0.5% of all that's, as it were, known to us through our bodies, taking in information, and to our nervous system as a whole, is actually the stuff that we're conscious of in the spotlight of attention, that left hemisphere spotlight. And coming out of it into consciousness is necessary for some to do some things. To write, for example, sometimes to get going, but then you need to let go of it and allow things to come to and through you. So Iain Whitehead, who's a philosopher I very greatly admire, and I think is probably the greatest philosopher of the last 100 years, makes this point and says that conscious examination is like cavalry charges in battle. So he's writing this around the time of the First World War, which was probably the last time there ever were cavalry charges. But they're like cavalry charges in battle. They can only be made at crucial moments. They require fresh horses, and they shouldn't be what you rely on. They're just a thing that can be brought in at a particular moment. And he made the point that a civilization is actually at its finest before it becomes too self-analytic. And I believe we're now in such a state of self-analysis that we've lost the feeling of the whole. Because when you analyze everything, you break up the whole, and it's from the whole that the meaning comes. I mean, it's very useful to take things apart as a temporary measure. That's what the left hemisphere does. The right hemisphere sees the whole, the Gestalt, German word which simply means a whole that cannot be reduced to parts without significant loss. So the right sees that, and the left hemisphere works on it and breaks it up and categorizes it. That's all fine. But that's not the end of the process. What needs to happen is that needs to come back to seeing the whole again, now enriched by what's happened while we were busy analyzing. But instead, we stay in this fragmented analytic mode, and we look at the heap of parts that we've generated and think, well, this doesn't mean anything. And an image I sometimes use is that of trying to understand a motorbike. If you want to understand a motorbike, you have to get on and ride it. But if instead you decide the way to understand a motorbike is to find out what it's made of, and you take it apart on the garage floor, and you end up with these heaps of bits and pieces of metal, and you go, well, blimey, I've no idea what this thing is. I've looked at the parts; they don't seem to mean anything. Now, a lot of what we take for science is simply the breaking up of everything and then going, well, search me. It doesn't seem to have any purpose or value. Whereas the purpose and the value lie in the whole. And once you've fragmented it, you've lost its purpose and value.
A few weeks ago, I went to see Professor Brian Cox live, and he ended the lecture by talking about the responsibility of world leaders in the context of an astrophysicist. And that he said that without life, the universe, by very definition, is meaningless. It's clearly that meaning enters the universe with consciousness, and consciousness is obviously the property of living things. And so without living things, there's no meaning in the universe. So if this is the only planet in the galaxy that hosts intelligent civilization, then it's essentially the only island of meaning in a sea of 400 billion stars, and therefore there's a tremendous responsibility to protect the island of meaning. So if we mess this up, then we're not just destroying this world, we'd be responsible for annihilating meaning forever in a galaxy. Do you share that view, and do you think that that ever crosses the mind of the people who hold this responsibility to that extent?
Well, that is brilliantly said. And I 1000% agree. It reminds me of the idea that 66 million years ago, an asteroid slammed into Earth and killed 70% of life, including all the dinosaurs. And as we know now, from me having reported and you having read the book, the only other event besides an asteroid strike that could kill that much life, and maybe all life, is a nuclear war. So the difference between the asteroid strike and nuclear war, as you pointed to, is humans. Our consciousness, our brilliance, our ability to create and make tools, starting with turning stones into arrowheads and sticks into spears, is how we began as a civilization. And imagine how we can evolve, right? But the evolution could absolutely stop with a nuclear war. So you and I are of two minds. Now, with that said, it appears this increasing trend, or maybe it's always been there, for our leaders, but now leaders who are in charge of that, the button, as you quoted Shire in the beginning, they are decreasingly interested in this idea of, the lofty ideals that you referred to about consciousness, about responsibility, about imagination, about creativity, about advancement, and far more interested in, having a big conflict with someone and winning. And there is no winning in nuclear war.
If someone is tuning into this now and they say, I have made the tough decision of going to Harvard instead of Yale, or if I was dating two people and I've elected to choose one over the other, and now perhaps I'm regretting it, what would be the best way to perhaps embrace the imperfect decision?
Well, the first thing, I wouldn't call it an imperfect decision. All right, that if you make that decision the outcome perfect, then it's a perfect decision. How that decision plays is entirely up to you. It's not as if you're not really part of all of that. But you're saying to yourself that you're looking at all of the advantages of the unchosen alternative. Consider all the ways it would have been disadvantageous. You can never, you have one life to lead, you lead it going forward, and what you do is make whatever happens work for you. It's not resigning yourself. It's a very active, in control position. But I think that regrets are saying you should have done something different. Now, if we say what I've been trying to impress upon you and your listeners right before all of this, what we do makes sense, or else we wouldn't do it. You chose the thing you chose to do for a good reason, and you're now not paying attention to that reason, and you're creating a fantasy. Oh, that, that other job, that other person, that other house, whatever it is, that's the unchosen alternative, would have been ideal. Things are neither problematic nor ideal on their own. It's the way we adapt to them, the way we understand them, that it works for us or it doesn't work for us.
I often think about that the symbol for crisis in Chinese is also the same symbol for opportunity. And it kind of represents that period that something could be perceived as a crisis, but it also has within it the seed of an opportunity, which I think you're so eloquently saying.
Yeah. A way of understanding it as an opportunity is that when we choose to do whatever we do, we just keep doing it. And there may be, remember that everything you're doing now, you probably decided you were going to be doing 5-10 years ago. That you take a job. If you were to start right now, what would you do? And the so-called crisis gives you a chance to sort of upgrade, to say, okay, well, what do I want to be right now? How do I want to be? What do I want to be doing? Because prior to that, you were just doing what the past you decided you should be doing, which doesn't mean it's wrong. It can also be glorious as long as we don't fall into the doing it mindlessly, the pitfall of becoming robots. That people don't realize that if you're not mindful, you're not there. And why waste your time? I mean, people think you should do all of these things on automatic pilot, but I think it's a mistake. I think if you're going to do it, you should show up for it for a number of reasons, and not the least of which is that when you're mindful, that means you're actively noticing things. That means the neurons are firing, and our research makes clear that that's literally and figuratively enlivening. So why ever want to just do it in some routine, mindless way? I don't understand it. I'm suggesting we should never be mindless, which people, bristle a little at. I said, "Oh my God, you should never be mindless. You shouldn't put things on order. What about you're playing tennis and you figured out how to hit that forehand and you keep doing it. Shouldn't you be mindless then? And then you can pay attention to others?" No, because you keep changing. The ball, the speed of the ball, everything is changing. And if you're not there, you can't take advantage of those changes. If you're taught how to swing that bat or club or racket in a sport, and you just keep doing it the same way over and over again, and let's say the night before a match or just a game, you didn't sleep well, a little pain in your shoulder, you should not hold the racket, the hockey stick, the golf club, in the exact same way. But you will hold it the same way, and your performance will suffer as a result of it. And that's a main difference between the experts and people who are just very good at something. That the experts are always learning. They're always modifying and adjusting. You don't want to lock yourself in at any point in your life. So that's going to determine how you are, how you do what you do in the future. And that's what we've all done. I mean, there's some advantage, oddly, for people to learn when they're older. Because if you learn how to do whatever it is when you're 10 years old, and you're really good at it, but you're 10 years old, for goodness sakes, And when you're 20 years old, you shouldn't be doing it exactly the same way. But the way most of us learn, which is mindlessly, we're likely to be doing it the same way. So people say practice, and for most of us, practice makes imperfect, not perfect. Because what we're doing is holding everything still so we can do it as if it's second nature, which means do it mindlessly. And what we want to do is our practice should be attending always to the subtle ways things are changing. And when we're doing that, we can take advantage of opportunities to which we're otherwise blind.
What are the key components of human intelligence that AI cannot replicate? And why are these elements important? Do you think that, for instance, AI systems could be better designed to understand and incorporate cultural contexts?
That's already sort of effectively what's happened with ChatGPT. It's very capable of emulating what seem like human empathy and human feelings. I think that the ultimate problem is that it's not actually subject to, it doesn't have to sit there like Paula Venables does, accounting for itself in front of an inquiry. Whether people think she's doing that well or not, it just doesn't have to do it. And in fact, it can be an excuse for a future CEO of a company to sort of say, well, the computer told me this, and so therefore I did it. Which, by the way, I mean, this isn't new. This is also how we use process in companies. Companies are constantly sort of saying, well, that was the process, we just followed it, and that was the regulation. And this is useful. Let's be clear, this is useful. This is why modern economies have become efficient, because doing the moral work of constantly looking at someone and sort of saying, well, actually, I'm a bit short of money in my company and I need to lay off some employees, and I'm going to do that as a human being with my personal relationships with those people, and knowing that they might have a young family or something like that. The moral burden of that at scale is enormous. And what actually happens if there aren't processes, humans give up. They just cut out their moral thinking and make really bad decisions. So the way we work in modern liberal democracies is, to prevent that happening, we have processes, we have laws that date back to the invention of writing, the Code of Hammurabi, and before sort of 1700 years BC, which support us in managing larger ecosystems. And they sort of replace this sort of sense of moral duty with a process that we've agreed upon, and there's some way of criticizing the process. And you can see what's going on with the machine is just more of the same. And this is where one of the things I talk about in the book, Honora O'Neill's Reith lectures from about 20 years ago, called A Question of Trust, which sort of look at what that process has to look like in order to be considered trustworthy. And it has to have intelligent accountability, as she calls it, which is humans explaining how and why it works. So we need to bring the technology closer to human beings. And that sort of sense of empathy, this is the sort of really interesting interface. This is where things, I think, get very difficult and our understanding is very poor. We don't understand how humans mislead and manipulate each other in conversations that well. We can see certain humans are good at it. We don't understand how some humans over social media do it very well. I don't normally reference science fiction, but there's the Foundation trilogy, there's this notion of the mule. The mule is this human being that is really good at manipulating other human beings, right? And you can imagine us creating a version of ChatGPT that's like that. And that's the kind of dystopian future. And that will happen because people are creating these technologies in a way where they're incentivized to make money for themselves. It won't happen because people are evil and scheming, or maybe it will a bit, but even if people aren't evil and scheming, this will just happen because companies can make money by manipulating people to do things they didn't know what to do. So we have to get on top of identifying where and when that's happening. And that requires a much deeper understanding of human psychology and the empathy you're talking about. Now, to the extent that that is happening, the embodied nature less so. Robotics is way behind this form of conversation. And the reason robotics is way behind, and this is really ironic, as I point out in the book, the first thing that came about, with our nervous system is about movement. It's about sensing and action. So the sensorics and the nervous system evolved together. And so there's this sort of enormous irony that, the abilities of almost every animal on the planet far exceed the abilities of our robots in order to do actions in the real world. And they came first, they're sort of evolving hundreds of millions of years ago. The brain that we're thinking of as special to us, we're a bit like the elephant. The elephant must go, well, it's all about noses. It's all about noses. Look at this. They can't do that with their nose. Look what I can do with my nose, And we're kind of a bit like that with our neocortex. It's all about the frontal cortex. Well, yes, it's great. The frontal cortex is great. But actually, the stuff that comes before the frontal cortex is really, really hard for us to do. So to build a machine that has the same embodied experience of the world, I think is quite a long way off. But interestingly, we didn't need that for the machine to start having a sense of it because it's read what we've written. Now, one of the things that's known with ChatGPT is that sometimes it makes quite clumsy mistakes about body shapes and things like that because we don't tend to write much about those things because they're so innate to us that we don't tend to talk about them. I think it's called the Hemingway style of writing, the iceberg writing. You only write what you want to communicate. You can leave the rest to the imagination. And most of the time, we can leave what's going on with the body to the imagination. And the computer, therefore, can't read about that, so it doesn't know about that. But despite that minimal information, people have already started showing that it has quite a good sense of embodiment, even just from reading our text. It's not sensing it in the same way as us. This is one of the key points I try and make. I call these things human analog machines, meaning that they don't compute as we do, but they compute in ways that are analogous to the way we're computing. That's what gives us a good sense of their ability to talk to them. And I think the really interesting thing, so about 10 years ago, there was a panel session with myself, Joshua Bengio, Demis Hassabis, Jürgen Schmidt-Huber, and Max Welling was chairing it. This was at ICML. And Jürgen was speaking before me. And Jürgen said something that I felt was a bold prediction at the time. And actually, he's turned out to be, I think, broadly right in the sense in which I think he meant it. He said, and one can argue this because these aren't well-defined concepts. I've already criticized that. But he said, in 10 years' time, we'll have something around the ability of a capuchin monkey. Now, I've already argued that this is an odd thing to talk about. But I certainly would have been a bit surprised if it's not the ability of a capuchin monkey, but we do have something that can plausibly converse, doing it in a very different way to humans do. But my immediate response is the one thing I'm sure we won't have is any robot that can do what a capuchin monkey does to climb a tree or swing around like a gibbon does or hover you can see I'm a bit obsessed with Kes. I had to read it as a kid, just thought it was an amazing book, but hover like a kestrel does by the side of a road looking for a vole. And nowhere near it. And I said that at the time. And, these progressions always seem to go slow, and then very rapid perceptually. That's not what's happening underneath. So the public, people will be like, oh, ChatGPT came from nowhere. It didn't. We'd all seen it coming. We didn't know when it would cross the threshold that would wow the public. And that's the perception of a very rapid advance, that it crossed this threshold, that it gets to a certain level of quality, that bang. Now, in robotics, we're not even seeing those sort of first signs that, we just need to keep going that direction and we'll cross the threshold and the public will be wowed because we'll have a flying kestrel thing. We're more where it felt like we were sort of in about 2005 with these machine learning technologies. We can do some things that we're excited about and seem impressive, but will just seem a little bit embarrassing or seem a little bit embarrassing from the perspective of the kestrel or the gibbon. So that fundamental embodied intelligence, what I call fast reacting or reflexive intelligence in the book, is something we're a very long way off. And one of the interesting things about the human being is that that's an integral part of our intelligence, that's the primary intelligence, that what our reflective intelligence does, or the slow reacting intelligence does, is kind of mop up the decisions that the fast reacting intelligence has already made. So by the time something gets to our brain and we're thinking about it, if it's something like falling over or running from a wolf or avoiding a sort of falling rock, by the time it gets through our prefrontal cortex, those decisions have already been made, and the prefrontal cortex is just sort of mopping up. But we get this sort of user illusion, this observer bias, that because our slow reacting intelligence is the thing that we spend all our time with by definition, because we're wandering around thinking, oh, wonder about this, wonder about that. We tend to think that that's the dominant part. But when it comes to looking at decisions, made in our body, it's all about these fast decisions. And they've come about through this process of evolution that has been, well, if you don't do that well, you die, so you don't exist. And that's very, very different to the intelligence that we've built, which is not as robust in the same way. It's a very fragile intelligence. It falls over very quickly because it's not been exposed to this environment for hundreds of millions of years, that basically if you don't react, then you'll disappear and you won't reproduce.
There's one idea you touch on early on in the book, and I probably get the pronunciation wrong, from a writer called Sasha Chapin. What's the pronunciation?
I think
Chapin.
Is it? Yeah, I think so.
And this idea of playing in the ruins, where he doesn't become the sort of idolized version of himself that the writer he always wanted to be, or always looked up to being. And when he realizes that isn't going to happen, it's quite a liberating moment, and he's able to become the writer that he actually could have been, not the one he was always aiming for. And I think that's a really important idea, and a lot of people in the traditional self-help space or hustle culture, as we've touched on, might view that as quite a defeatist mindset. Why shouldn't we view it in that way?
I mean, just to sort of unpack it a little bit more, and then I will say why I think it becomes clear then in some ways why it's not defeatist. He's talking about, for him, it was the worst thing that could happen. Like in his 20s, the worst thing that could happen would be that 10 years later than that, he'd realized that he was never going to be David Foster Wallace, right? That's the author that he sort of mentions as being a very deep admirer of. And the problem with that, of course, is that while you still think that any particular sort of utopian ideal might come around, you're not giving your full soul and attention and energy to your real life and to what you can do creatively. You're targeting this very specific goal, which is kind of someone else's goal anyway, right? Because it was for David Foster Wallace to be David Foster Wallace, and God knows he had a troubled life. So it's not really the gift that you've got to give. It's your way of characterizing it in somebody else's terms. And it's impossible, right? In some sense, it's not possible for any of us. It's not just, I'm not claiming that he was a less talented writer. He's a very talented writer. It's just that this external image of like being like someone else is not, you can never be, Saul Bellow or Charles Dickens, or, these people are themselves. So it's the defeat that is so powerful, and it's it's a kind of an empowering defeat. This is something that I've noticed runs through my writing, almost not deliberately, but there are all sorts of contexts where admitting defeat is actually a source of power and focus and accomplishment. And in this case, he means, once you're no longer telling yourself all sorts of stories about what your creativity has got to look like one day in the future, then you can just play, right? Then you can just do the stuff on the page that like excites you and brings you alive. And that's when you do the things that are original and unique and also can have commercial success and also all the rest of it. So you're sort of, there are often these situations where we have some kind of goal that is in some sense impossible, becoming exactly the same as another famous writer, getting on top of every single email and demand that we could possibly be sent that could possibly come our way. I could mention 20 more. And there's just a real liberation in accepting that that's impossible. And the result is not that you then sit on your couch feeling depressed and not creating anything. The result is it's like, oh, I don't have to do that. Now I'm free to do this. And, that kind of transformation has meant a big has meant a great deal in my life too, because you unleash energy and power and attention when you're not using it on this quest to sort of overcome the human condition, which you're never going to succeed in.
As people call into the Ramsey show, the most common situation we walk into is they're doing a lot of good things. They're just trying to do it all at once, and they're not making any progress. They're like, hey, I'm trying to pay off my debt, but I'm also investing in my retirement plan, but I'm also trying to save up the down payment, and I'm trying to get the emergency fund built up, but I need to upgrade the car. And we're just like, whoa, slow down, slow your roll. And so what we tell them to do is follow the baby steps, which is get $1,000 saved. That's the only thing you're focused on. Make minimum payments on your debts. Once you have $1,000 in the bank, move on to baby step 2. Pay off all the consumer debt except the house using the debt snowball method. That means smallest to largest balance, ignore the interest rate, because if we were doing math, we wouldn't be in debt. And so now's not the time to start calculating which path is the best. We want the fastest path to get out of debt, and that is the debt snowball method. Once you're out of consumer debt, you freed up all these payments in your life. So now you can easily save up that emergency fund in another 6 to 12 months. And now you have a force field between you and life that helps you never go back into debt again. Why do you need the credit card as an emergency blanket when you have $10, $15, $20,000 sitting there ready to protect you? And now and only then are you ready to invest. Because most people, as they call in, Joe, they're going, hey, I'm investing 3%. I'm like, well, that's not enough to survive in retirement. You need to be investing 15%. And so that's what you can do in baby step 4 without any payments. And then once you're doing baby step 4, you're saving for retirement, 15%. You're putting some money away for college if you have kids. You're paying off the house early, knocking out that mortgage, knocking down the principal balance. Once you have all that knocked out, now we can build wealth and give. Now we can really amp up our investing. We can amp up our giving. We can spend more and increase our lifestyle. But the problem is people want to increase their lifestyle before they've done any of these steps. And there's an order to the chaos, and you've got to sacrifice for a short season to have a much longer season of peace and freedom.
Someone listening to this is in a bad position. So the first 2 steps they do, get £1,000 in my case, or $1,000 in your case, put that into an emergency savings account. Then using the debt snowball method, which is paying off in order of lowest balance to highest balance, going through that order. And I take it that is due that you want some psychological momentum there. You want to get that small win. You want to get that hit the dopamine. You want to go, I've just got my first financial win in a long time. Now I can keep going.
Absolutely. And, a lot of people want to argue because they want to do the avalanche method, which is pay the highest interest debts first, which sounds great on paper. The problem is most people can't follow through with that. And it's not even our opinion anymore because we've seen 10 million people now go through this plan with success. It's also studies from Time Magazine and Harvard. They're all saying, hey, that Dave Ramsey guy's right. The debt snowball method psychologically and in reality is the best way to pay off your debt. And it's the same method I use to get rid of my $40,000 in 18 months. And I believe it's possible for anyone out there. And obviously, the more debt you have and the less income you have, it might take longer. For some people, it doesn't take 2 years. It takes 5 years, 7 years. But on average, we found people can do this in 2 years or less with intensity, which means you're cutting the subscriptions, you're cutting down your lifestyle, you're not eating out all the time, you're maybe working a side hustle or an extra job. But for a short season, if you can just focus and do that, you're going to have so much freedom on the other side.
Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed and took something from the lessons in this video. If you don't already, please subscribe to the Freedom Pact YouTube channel. It is the #1 way you can help support the show. And don't forget that all our podcasts are available in audio format on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We're there. Thank you for supporting the Freedom Pact, and we'll see you next year.